Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Trevor Moffat here from the Improvement Service, and I'm joined today by Nick Wright and Kathie Pollard. Nick is from Nick Wright Planning and is an independent planning consultant, and Kathie works for the Scottish Land Commission. If you just bear with me, I'll bring them both on screen just now.
Hello.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, everyone.
Hi there.
Hi, Kathie. I'll just go through some quick housekeeping things and pass over to Nick and Kathie for the main presentation. Our webinar today will be on the research on the value of early engagement for land use planning. We will have a session for about 30 to 35 minutes of presentation, and that will be followed by a Q&A. Thanks to everyone who's already sent questions in. We'll try to pick those up as best we can. But if you wish to ask a question at any point, you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there'll be a small questions pop out on the sidebar. Please just use that to type it in, and we'll pick that up as well. If you have any technical difficulties as well, please also use that box, and I'll try and address that as best as I can throughout the webinar. We will be passing over to Kathie shortly. We have quite a few slides to go through. We'll be actually minimising our webcams while Kathie and Nick run through the slides, just due to the detail on them, just to make sure you can see everything properly. And for the Q&A, we'll bring our screens back on. But we will be able to hear you throughout. And as I said, if you get any difficulties, just please use the question box to contact me. And I'll just pass over to Kathie just now, and you'll see our faces disappear. Over to you, Kathie.
Great, thank you very much, Trevor, and great to see so many of you signing in. I think we've just reached 108 attendees. That's brilliant. So thank you very much for spending your afternoon listening to the findings of this piece of research. And if you'd like to tweet about it, we've got a hashtag. It's hashtag land for housing. So it'd be great to follow the conversation on Twitter as well. So we started this piece of research early on this year in January. And we think it's really relevant to the debate on land reform. But just to give you a bit more context on what land reform in Scotland is and actually what it isn't. So we believe that land is at the heart of Scotland's identity and communities and economy. It enables growth and productivity and delivers multiple benefits for community, regeneration, as well as placemaking outcomes. So it really matters that it's owned and used in a fair and productive way. And really, it's about making more of Scotland's land for more of Scotland's people. And just it's important to highlight, particularly for this piece of work, that it is not just all about rural Scotland, but very much about urban Scotland as well. So we've got a poll here. It would be great to see who's in the room today. I think this will be of interest to many, just to gather some views on who's here. Trevor, is that possible?
Yep, I'll just bring up a slightly different screen for the delegates to fill in.
Thank you. So yes, we're just interested to see who's joined us today. There's several options there. So if you could spend a couple of seconds just filling that out. There we go. Thank you very much. So we've got a good.
Okay, you should be able to.
A good mix. We've got 4% developer landowners, almost 50% planning authorities, 20% consultants and agents, 3% community organisations, and about a quarter of others. So that's great to see a diverse mix of people here today. Thank you. And I think this just highlights the fact that the way land reform matters and the way land is used, managed and owned is relevant to all of us here today. And our work priorities, our 4 areas of work, I think reflect a lot of the conversations of today. So the Scottish Land Commission was set up in 2017 as a result of the Land Reform Act of 2016. And we've got 4 key priorities: land for housing and development, modernising land ownership, land use decision making, and agricultural land holdings. And I think today's research really reflects the land for housing and development and land use decision making side of things. core to our work is a document called the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. So this was a document that is actually a world first, and it expresses what land rights and responsibilities look like, and this is key to our work streams. As a result of the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement and Principle 6, which is directly relevant to engagement of communities, the Scottish Government published guidance on engaging communities on decisions relating to land. It provides some advice on what is reasonable and what can be expected of land use and management. And what the Land Commission did was, through its programme of good practice, it produced protocols which really develop a practical way for landowners and land managers and communities to work together, and it helps communities understand what they can reasonably expect. So as part of implementing the guidance that the Scottish Government produced, the Land Commission has a good practice team, and as part of this work last year, the team published 2 surveys measuring community engagement, both from a community perspective, but also from a landowner and land manager perspective. And interestingly, it showed us that 51% of urban respondents said that they actually don't know who owns their land in their local area or how to contact them. And 35% of all community respondents reported that they had little or no understanding of how decisions relating to land are made. So for us, it gave us the view that there is still quite a lot of work to be done, and is perhaps useful context for this research. And so we know that in current reforms relating to the Planning Act and Land Reform Act and Community Empowerment Act, there's a big emphasis on community engagement. But based on our findings and the surveys, we realise that there's still a lot of work to be done. And why aren't more of us doing it? So we commissioned this piece of research and got Nick Wright and Stephen Tolson to undertake an investigation into the benefits of early engagement in land use decisions, to look at how we, the Land Commission, can best support the relationship between communities and decision makers in land use planning, but also to share the findings and implications across all land use sectors. So that's taking those lessons and applying them beyond the development process. So that's where my bit of the presentation ends for the moment. I'd like to hand over to Nick.
Thanks a lot, Kathie. Before I talk through the research findings, I'll just quickly explain a little bit more about what we were hoping to achieve. And I should say a big thank you to Stephen, who I think is listening in today. It was largely through Stephen's contacts in the development industry that we were able to get to so many people, and also through his knowledge of the industry as well. So what we're hoping to achieve, well, you'll see as we're, sorry, just getting the slides to move forward. Right, you'll see that there are grey quote boxes on the screen, which are taken from the research report. That top quote there is from one developer we spoke to, who said, basically, our default is that we avoid early engagement if we can. Now, none of us want to hear that, but we know that's the truth amongst some people in the development industry. So our purpose was to acknowledge there are skeptics out there, and rather than just try and tell those skeptics it's good to do early engagement because it's a good thing, instead to get evidence from those developers who do good engagement, and to use that to explain to others why it's a benefit to them. So that was really the whole purpose of the research. I'll explain a little bit about who we spoke to. So how did we go about the research? Well, we had 44 structured interviews, and you can see from the pie chart there, most of those were developers or landowners or their consultants and their agents. We also spoke to a handful of planning authorities to get their perspective, and also to representative bodies like Scottish Communities Alliance, Planning Democracy, and umbrella bodies from the kind of house building and landowning and planning sectors as well. And we're very grateful, obviously, to all those who were involved. What we were trying to do was to make sure that we got to a good, not only a good range of different kinds of people, but a good range of types of location where proposals have been put forward by developers, greenfield and brownfield as well, as you can see on the table on the left there, different kinds of proposed land use, residential, commercial, mixed use, and also not just major planning applications, which obviously have to have pre-application consultation for 12 weeks in advance of a planning application, but also smaller applications where developers had done good community engagement, to find out more about that. And from those 44 interviews, we generated 11 case studies, as you can see on the right there. It's a bit fuzzy, sorry, which varied from very large proposals. So number 11, for example, is Winchborough, with nearly 4,000 homes over a fair period of time, down to much smaller ones, like number 9 is a 35 home development in Killane, and there's a whole range in between those. And there's more information in the full report about each of those, obviously. I'll touch on some of them as we go through. So, research findings. What did we learn? Well, I've split this into 5 sections, and I'll go through each one by one. First of all, from the perspective of those we spoke to, those in the development industry, how is engagement working at the moment? What's their experience of it? There were 12 main themes came up from those we asked. And I'll run through these in small groups. So first of all, with a group of 4 of those points there, do read the quotes as I'm talking, because I won't read through every quote. So very often we heard from many developers that engagement starts from a negative position, and that word mistrustful came up an awful lot, which I'll refer to again a few times. It's a recurring theme. And in fact, the Scottish Government's research on community engagement, on barriers to community engagement in planning 3 or 4 years ago, found that lack of trust was one of the biggest barriers to community engagement. So that was borne out by this research as well. Engagement can very often be very irrational, as the second quote says there. It can be very emotive. A lack of objectivity was raised by a number of developers and their consultants, which probably gives the lie to the third point there about giving information to people so they can make informed judgments about proposals is really important. We heard that from a lot of developers, explaining about exactly the facts and figures of what they're proposing, and also the planning policy background against which they're towards which they're working quite often. And the fourth point there is people hardly ever write in support of a proposal, but they'll happily write in an object. The point being, it's easier to object than it is to support a proposal. So that's all part of that, starting from a negative position. A couple of other points that we heard from the industry, the statutory minimum, by which people were referring to the 12-week legal requirement for pre-application consultation before major applications, that statutory minimum of an exhibition, that's just not enough. And that longer quote at the top there is an example from an urban developer, a house builder, saying, yeah, we did the statutory application, the statutory consultation, but we wanted to explore a particular issue of concern to local people in more detail. So we did more than that, and that was really helpful. Second quote, the system doesn't incentivize good behavior, and a lot of developers referred to it has a habit of becoming a tick box mentality, a tick box exercise. I'll come back to that later on. Most developers said it's here to stay, so let's make the most of it. Now, I say most, that's the ones we spoke to, the ones who found benefit from it. When you think of who's involved in the development process, there are various players. Communities were raised, clearly. The first quote there, quite a few developers referred to the different kinds of community. This was a typical comment. An affluent area might have more of a focus on conservation or preservation or protection, whereas a deprived location, the local people could be equally proud of where they live, their community, but they might be looking for the place perhaps to be regenerated and improved more than in the more affluent area. And then within the community, developers were, the ones we spoke to, were very aware that somebody who lived next to a site, for example, who who looked over a site where there was a proposal, they may have concerns about how the buildings would appear, how they would look, what would be the effect on their house. Whereas people who lived a few streets away might have completely different interests around things like affordable homes and jobs, and could they get access to new housing. So communities are home to diverse interests and motivations. Community councils came up an awful lot as well, seen as having a vital role in the system. Indeed, they've got a statutory role in the planning system, but very inconsistent, and more developers commented on the inconsistency. So that top quote, not necessarily reflecting requirements and aspirations of the wider community. More developers referred to that than to a relatively smaller number of good examples where community councils have taken the time to respond, to understand the facts and that kind of thing. I think that bottom quote there, community councils are very influential and often don't realize that. Social media was very interesting. A lot of developers were very wary of social media and kept away from it because of the concern about how emotive it could get and the way it could channel a lot of negativity. But as the middle quote suggests, there were a small number of developers we spoke to who saw it as a great opportunity to try and convey information to people about what they were trying to achieve, and also to get to a wider range of demographic of people. Press. Interestingly, if we'd done this 10 years ago, I'm sure the press would have been far more mentioned, but they were hardly mentioned at all in the interviews that we did. And finally, local authorities came in for a lot of comment. Council officers were seen as really important, and a lot of developers would like local authority officers to engage more in engagement, working together. I'll come back to that. But they recognized that the lack of resources and skills and experience possibly as well made that difficult for local authorities. So developers weren't critical of officers at all. They were more critical of elected members. I don't know if there are any here in the audience today, but this was a typical quote of politicians have a vital role to play in the development process, but they rarely lead. And if you read on down, as one gets closer to the planning application stage, it's apparent that parties divide into us and them, as opposed to a narrative that is about we. And that narrative about we was often referred to as local authorities using developers and engagement and delivery to deliver their LDP, a point which I'll come back to. So, in the eyes of the development industry folk that we spoke to, what does early engagement look like at the moment? In summary, I'll go through this quite quickly so we have more time for the benefits. A number of themes came out, as you can see on the screen there. For those of you who are familiar with engagement, or who know, for example, the national standards for community engagement, or the PAS speed guidelines on engagement in planning, I don't think any of these things will be a surprise to you. They reflect what's good practice. They reflect good guidance. I'll just pick out on a couple of slides some quotes that we got from developers, which I think these three here illustrate what good practice is already being done by some developers in engaging young people, as you can see at the top, about using technology. We've had that quote already there. And the bottom one about generating survey data from a wide range of people to feed in to council and councillor and planning officer decision making. So those are all good practice. And the same here as well for another developer who realizes in that first paragraph, we as an industry need to get to all those folk who are doing other things on Saturday mornings. So this particular developer was thinking, how can we do quite simple things to get, rather than get people come to us, to our events, we go to them, to a nursery and toddler event or to McDonald's drive-through, to engage a wider demographic and get to more people and get more information out there. This developer talked about the need to spend time in a community in order to build trust, and I'll come back to that point again later on. And then these three quotes, I've talked about the need for information already. Our developers recognize that information needs to flow in order to build trusting relationships, blah, blah, blah. Second quote, to help people make more informed judgments. And I've highlighted that point about signposting the relevance of national matters. So the point that these developers were making was really, it's important to inform people about what the developer wants to do, but also how that fits with local planning policy and therefore with the national public interest as well. I particularly like that quote at the bottom there. Why not have surveys like in airport toilets where you press a smiley face or an unhappy face on an iPad to quickly register your view on a proposal, because it could produce valuable data, a bit like on the previous slide. So these are good things which are being thought of by the industry. And this one, the final one under this section, was from a developer who owns a big site, happens to be in Glasgow, and had been knocked back for planning consent. And they've said in the second paragraph, before they, rather than just put another application in, before they even think about what to do with the site, they want to encourage local groups to do meanwhile activities on the site as a way of thinking about what the site could be in the future, which they see not as a substitute for pre-application consultation, but something that happens before it. Now, to my mind, that's a great example of co-design. And I think a lot of local authorities would struggle to do that because of the constraints on them. So again, there are good things happening out there. Right, onto the real meat of this, which is what are the benefits of early engagement from a developer's perspective, from a landowner's perspective? Well, there's a lot more in the report, obviously, about each of these. I'm not going to go into great detail. Hopefully this will whet your appetite to have a look. But there were 8 main themes that we subdivided people's comments into about the benefits of engagement. So first of all, it can benefit any proposal. That top comment there, the developer said they always engage, irrespective of the size of the development, because they see benefits. And the second quote is very similar. And when you think about why, well, the third quote, someone says, yes, well, we didn't have to do engagement because it was a local application, not major, only for 10 houses. But following engagement, they ended up with local support for 30 dwellings. Now, that's a benefit for the developer, clearly, they build more houses, but it's also a benefit for the public as well, because we have an acknowledged housing crisis, and that helps people to get access to homes, if they're in the right place, of course. I said about case studies earlier on. One of them was in Kildare, I mentioned already. That was for a local application. No pre-application consultation was required, but the developer did some anyway. That actually resulted in an increased number of homes being proposed because of the consultation, because of an aspiration in the community for more affordable housing. So more smaller homes were built as a result of that. And I might mention Kildare again a bit later on for another reason. Second area of benefits, it can speed up the process. There were mixed views on whether it always does, but some developers and landowners said, yes, it definitely can. One of them said, the counterfactual is very strong. I struggle to think of developers who stood up and said, I didn't invest in engagement here, and it got me through planning faster. The second quote there, this particular developer said they didn't think it did shorten the process, but it allows the community to raise issues which can be addressed. And they also said that the way they run it is they don't add 12 weeks on for pre-application consultation. It just runs in parallel as part of the design and development process. So there's no extra time involved. I won't talk about Glen Trust just now. It's a case study in the report, but I'll probably mention it briefly later on. Second area of benefits, I've grouped 3 together. So an opportunity to explain and to inform, which I've already mentioned, and I've got a couple of quotes about that. Helps to secure planning consent, so that's a kind of selfish benefit, if you like, for developer. Helps to iron out problems earlier on as related to that. And here are a couple of points about that. Fear of the unknown leads people to make objections. That's back to that point at the very start, about lack of trust and starting from a negative viewpoint. The second quote is interesting. if we hadn't done the engagement, it would have been harder to get our point across. This was for a big development, and the developer wanted to explain to people in the city why investing in the city centre to create jobs was a good thing, and explain how many would be created and the purpose for doing it, even though there was controversy about other aspects of the proposal. If it hadn't been done, the developer suspected the outcome would have been worse and it would have taken a lot longer. I won't talk about the third point. Next slide. These top 2 points here, both of them talk about investing in engagement, in order to de-risk the process. The top quote is quite blatant about that was the purpose of doing engagement, was to de-risk the process, to reduce the risk of uncertainty and delay later on. And both those quotes show how engagement resulted in a smaller number of objections and therefore an easier planning process. And those are from the landowners and developers who were leading the process. And the bottom quote, back to that point about helping generate trust and support. This quite lengthy quote here is worth reading. It's from a planning authority, not from a developer. And as the first paragraph says, early engagement doesn't just help developers, but it helps the planning authority to deliver its aim. And the point that was made quite often was helps a local authority to deliver its local development plan, because an LDP is owned by the local authority. When we do councillor training, we talk about how it's the councillor's LDP. They should lead and defend and also promote it. And this planning authority really got that. And in the second and third paragraphs, they talked about they'd encouraged developers on big applications in previous years to do good engagement, and they were seeing the fruits of that now in fewer objections as those planning applications came through. Another benefit was about improving development quality. I've already touched upon some examples of that, I think, but these two quotes on the left are either end of the scale, if you like. So the top quote there is for a big proposal where big concerns amongst the local community about a contaminated site, which they wanted to be sorted out. So the developer amended the proposals to remediate that, create a public park, big cost of £6 million, but they thought it was an improvement and worthwhile. Whereas the bottom quote, no cost at all. People were concerned about, well, not concerned, they were keen to have a space to go sledging. So it was simply a case of making sure that there was a grassy slope designed into the proposal where people could go sledging if it was snowing. That's free to do. The Broxburn case study that's in the report on the right there, I'll talk about that in the Q&A. I think it's probably more appropriate there if it comes up. Almost there on the benefits. So building trust, I've already mentioned, but developers and landowners saw this as a really important benefit, bringing sides together, breaking down barriers. As the second quote there says, if you build relationships and trust, that ensures that people and community groups are generally informed and as a result become more supportive. So that was one developer's experience. And finally, building a sense of community was a benefit that was raised by a relatively small number of developers, generally larger ones. So one of them said in the past they've established a community chest in order to give funding out for community activities, in order to help generate a sense of community. And then the bottom quote is a similar thing about encouraging communities, giving them the means of owning and investing in assets, which might be open space or a community building, very much linked to the community empowerment agenda from the government. So those are extra benefits of engagement. Right, two final bits of the presentation. Quite briefly, how much does engagement cost? We were keen to get figures about the cost of engagement. This proved to be quite difficult, not least because most developers we spoke to didn't actually keep dedicated figures or budget lines for engagement. It was wrapped up in other costs and other fees. And even where there were figures, it was quite difficult. They were sensitive for commercial reasons about explaining how much. But there is information in the report about ballpark figures for the costs of engagement. Some of the comments that we got were very revealing, though. So the top quote there, yes, there are slightly additional costs associated with good consultation, according to one house builder here, but they aren't substantial. At the end of the day, time is the killer. So from a developer's perspective, you know, it's not the consultation fees or the hire of the hall or whatever it costs, the website design that costs the money. It's the debt, it's delay. That's what drains money. Second point, it costs less to engage more. The costs of engaging badly are enormous. They tend to be overwhelming. An angry community, politicians are upset, you've already paid for the land, you can't get the consent. You can see the situation. And then the final point on that slide is often developers balk at the value of engagement, not the cost. And the point being that simply doing a tick box engagement to meet a statutory requirement might not create any value or benefits because the engagement isn't really very good. Whereas engagement that costs more money and is more meaningful might create huge value. And I guess an example of that is this next slide, where a development value of £100 million for a city centre office block, the fees, the developer said, for the consultation were 100,000, just over that, which is very expensive compared to others that we heard of. But they didn't begrudge a penny of it. They thought it was very worthwhile because it eased the whole process and it helped them get their point of view across and help discussion about the application. So finally, a way forward. Well, as with any report, you would expect there to be a set of recommendations. Some of this is new, some of it's not. So there are 4 basic points in the recommendations. The first is that pre-application consultation is too late. Consultation really needs to start much earlier in the process. It was the widespread conclusion of research participants that consultation should be brought forward to start at the site acquisition and planning policy stage. So where local development plans and in the future local place plans set the vision and policy for communities. And where the principle of development is established in the LDP, it shouldn't then be revisited again through engagement at the planning application stage. That should be established at that much earlier point. Second area was about the bigger need to support good practice through something like new national standards for community engagement and planning. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this area, there's a diagram in the report which summarizes the plethora of guidance that's already available on community engagement in terms of land reform, in terms of community empowerment, and in terms of planning. So there's lots of advice that's available, and there's links in the report to all that. And there are two particular documents that are very useful. There's the National Standards for Community Engagement, and there's the PAS Speed Guidance for Community Engagement in Planning. But there's no kind of official guidance that brings all that together just around planning. So those 2 I mentioned form a really good basis, and we give some indicators, some suggestions in the report of what these new national standards should incorporate. Things like the importance of informing, that I've talked about already, about policy and about facts and figures, and also for large-scale developments, the need to engage at every stage in the process in different ways, right from site acquisition through planning policy and principle, through planning applications to construction, right through to community building when people come to live on the site. There's more in the report on that, obviously. Collaborative endeavour is the third point we've got there, and I've already made the point about local development plans and local authorities being their document, and more early engagement is a way of local authorities being able to deliver their LDP. but it needs to be a collaborative endeavour of developers working with local authorities and vice versa, and also, of course, with communities as well. And that would help to deliver not just the LDP, but national objectives like climate change, health and well-being, inclusive growth, and so on. So that's that collaborative endeavour point, and a few of the case studies touch on that. So Killane, for example, the planning officer from the local authority got involved at a public meeting to explain to the local community alongside the developers who were there. This site is allocated in the LDP. It's already zoned for housing, so let's not go back on that again and reopen that debate. That was a very helpful intervention there, apparently. Fort William 2040 is another case study of local industry and the local authority working together to plan out the future of the town. Dargaville Village in Bishopton has been I wouldn't say partnership, that's too strong, but a collaboration of the local authority and the landowner going back over 20 years to when the site first became available for development, potentially. And Glen Tress, I've mentioned already, is another collaborative example, which led where a master plan was produced from early engagement, led to supplementary guidance, and then that eased the way for planning applications compared to the experience of the same developer in England, where they hadn't had that situation and they had great trouble at the planning application stage. I guess because people weren't aware of the benefits that came out of the proposals through things like job creation and supporting the economy and that kind of thing. So there's more on those case studies in the report. Right, penultimate slide. I thought it was important to say this point here from one developer who was making very clear that they didn't think there was going to be much resistance from house builders anyway about making consultation better, more relevant, and less box ticking, because there are clear benefits from it. And in a way, the stats that Kathie said, 73% she mentioned earlier on, landowners and managers seeing benefits of community engagement, that also supports this as well. So we shouldn't lack confidence about trying to get better engagement. And the final point is that better engagement it's not about subsidizing developers, that's not the point. It's about helping deliver all these elements of Scottish Government policy and local development plan policy around better health, around more homes, around jobs, healthy communities, infrastructure, community empowerment, land reform. That's the prize from improving community engagement. That's what we should be aiming for. Well, I'm sure you've all got questions that you'd like to ask, and they've probably been coming in, I haven't been looking, which we'll come on to in a second, but I think Kathie's got a few slides that she'd just like to finish up with. So I'll pass back to you, Kathie.
Thank you. Great, thank you. Just to finish off, I want to summarise what the next steps are for the Scottish Land Commission and the implications for our wider work. So there are two direct links to a couple of our work streams, and there's one. There's a review ongoing at the moment on land for housing and development. We published several reports last week, and we see the work on early engagement as part of that. It's really important to embed the findings as we move towards a more collaborative approach to land for housing and development. And this very much builds on our work on public interest-led development. Arguably, this is the public interest, but also land value capture, something that was hotly debated in the Planning Act, and really our evidence suggests that early engagement adds a lot of value and quite frankly makes good business sense. So here we have a role in explaining those benefits of early engagement so that we can all achieve better outcomes. So we will be publishing the findings of the review in January 21. So there'll be ongoing publications and engagement on this. So watch this space. And the other area where there are links is to our good practice programme. And we've got a self-assessment scheme going on at the moment. So we're looking for volunteers to come forward, to landowners, land managers, to undertake these voluntary self-assessments of how they might be performing in relation to the land rights and responsibility statement. So we'd really welcome volunteers to come forward, particularly from the development and planning and local authority sector. So please do get in touch with us if you're keen to find out more. We're also working on case studies and resources, and we've just put together a really great new web page which has all the case studies and resources that Nick mentioned. So we'll be sending out a link after this webinar. And finally, I'd just like to remind everyone that we've got a good practice team and 2 community engagement advisors who'd be more than happy to advise on where to find resources and our route maps. They're very easy to contact, so please do get in touch if you'd like some more information. So that's really where we see this work leading. But before we move on to the Q&A, I think it's really important for us, and again, there'll be a chance in the survey that follows this webinar, to ask us what we could be doing. And so as part of that, I'd like to ask you, has anything today given you any ideas about changes that your organisation could make to improve practice? We've got 3 options there, and again, the survey later on will give you a chance to explain perhaps what you'd like to pick up in practice, but it'll be nice to see whether there's anything today that has made you change your mind perhaps. So Trevor, I'm not sure if that's possible.
Hi, Kathie. Having a minor technical difficulty at the moment. I can't bring up that poll. Apologies. I have managed to capture this in the survey at the end though, so we will cover that question.
Okay.
When you log out at the end of today's presentation. Apologies.
That's okay, fantastic. Well, I think that leads us to the end of the actual presentation bit, but I know there's quite a few questions that have come in, so should we take some of those now?
Thanks very much, Kathie and Nick. I will just start bringing up reading out some questions to you. I'll just take control of my screen just now. Okay, the first question I've got here from the audience is, how do we embed local place plan principles into the work we are currently undertaking? I don't know if Kathie or Nick wants to address that first.
I think maybe this is one for Nick, having been involved in similar activities.
Yes. Is there any suggestion of what sort of activity? Does it mean local?
No, I'm not getting more detail than that at the moment. It was just, I think, in general, what's been done with the local place plans that could be advised by the research we've carried out.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think local place plans offer a great opportunity to, when you think of the informing bit that I've been talking about, and helping local communities understand, I guess, the kind of wider public interest that's going on out there beyond their doorstep, around creating jobs and access to housing and climate change and all these things. So I see local place plans as a great way of collaborative working between communities, so they understand the public interest, but also so the public sector and developers understand community aspirations. And at the local level, there's being a nexus for discussion to try and produce local policy and proposals, not just about planning, about lots of things, which allow local proposals to reflect, to contribute to national things, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. I see there as being a really good opportunity. Now, we don't know yet if that's exactly how local place plans are going to work, because we've not had the secondary legislation and guidance yet, which is due out at some point next year. But that's how I hope they could work.
And I also think that it captures that really early on aspiration for a place, which can later on be picked up through the development process. But I think it's almost before any development can take place. So it very much fits in with the findings.
Okay, thank you both. The second question I've got from in advance was, one of the report headings is, it's easier to object than support. What are your thoughts on how to upfront encourage support?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's about encouraging support. I think that's too strong. But from my point of view, I think it's more about it's back to informing again. It's trying to avoid a knee-jerk reaction where people might think, I mean, from the window here, I can see a bit of ground across the road from me, which happens to be covered in grass. And if someone just comes along and proposes a development on that site, then my immediate reaction is going to be, oh, I don't like that. I don't know what's going on. Whereas some kind of information about why that's being proposed, maybe that site is already zoned for some use, employment or housing or whatever. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's zoned for green space. But giving more information earlier on, that's really the benefit, I think. So it's not so much about showing support as in, for me personally, as about informing people as to the whole situation. That one of the troubles with planning, I guess, is that the national standards for community engagement are very much about how do you foster community development? How do you help communities get what they want? And that's absolutely fine. I've no issue with that at all. I'm a great supporter of the national standards. What they don't do is help where you have to combine public policy from above, if you like, with local aspirations. And that's the particular problem which planning faces. So I think planning authorities have a particular role, not necessarily treading a fine line, not necessarily supporting proposals always, especially early on, but in informing about the situation and the other perspectives. I hope that makes some sense. Quite a long and rambling response, sorry.
Yeah, and I think something that I wrote down earlier from the report is that there was an example where there were 3 phases of engagement, which involved 1,000 participants, and at the end they received 40 objections and only a few that were particularly strong. So for me, it's something about mitigating the risks early on, and doing engagement really effectively will help you add value, but also can actually really enrich the development outcomes as well. So that's something that really stood out for me.
Thank you both. The next question is a little bit different. During free-pitched community engagement, it can be common that people with loud voices and strong opinions drown out quieter but equally valid views from others. Have you found any engagement methods that enable those views to be heard more equally?
Well, that came up a lot from developers and landowners, and there's a lot of quotes in the report about how to get around that and suggestions. I mentioned a couple earlier on in the presentation, but there were lots of examples in the report of developers trying to get around that. And as they get around it, it's not to shut up the ones who they're hearing, but to get to a broader demographic, so they get a greater range, a more representative range. So things like SurveyMonkey was on one of the slides earlier on, using online, using social media as a way of getting out to people. Although, so the recent move to doing pre-application consultation online through COVID-19, it's been well documented elsewhere that has resulted in getting to more people, because that's what happens when you go online with engagement. I've seen it myself through my own work as well. So there's lots in the report about that. And also that triangular diagram I showed earlier on has links to guidance and support, and they have a lot of information about that as well. So that's in the back of the report. So that's worth a look if people are interested in finding out what works.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you touched upon online engagement, because it's been one of the kind of key themes running through the questions we're getting in at the moment. How have you seen this shift to digital consultation help improve engagement? Is there any particular points of note that you want to share with the audience?
Well, Kathie might have some thoughts on this as well. I mean, what I was pleasantly surprised about was when we interviewed developers and landowners, who I didn't usually work with as part of my day-to-day work. I work with local authorities and community groups most of the time. I was pleasantly surprised how much good practice there was going on. And again, there are examples in the report of that. Now, I think the point is not all developers are doing that good practice, but there's enough who are to build out from that and encourage other developers to learn from what those good ones are doing and the benefits it brings. I think that's at the heart of this work, really, rather than people listening to people like me say, here's how to engage. You should really listen to other developers to say how they do it. And I guess there are plenty of examples in the report to start that conversation.
Yes, and I certainly, our case studies on the good practice web pages will highlight different ways of engaging, and online engagement is obviously an important part of that, and increasingly so at the moment. And there's loads of webinars and things going on that talk about the current situation. But I think having that online platform creates an ongoing dialogue with the community, which I think is really key, and something that the report also touches on. So again, I can point you towards the website, but there's a lot of good practice out there already. It's just encouraging everyone to do more of it.
One thing to add, actually, Kathie's just made me think, the Transforming Planning Scottish Government website, transformingplanning.scot, has a digital section on the menu system. And in the last couple of weeks, there's been some good examples put up on that of good engagement, really as a response to COVID-19. As you said, a lot of the questions refer to that. There's a really useful matrix or table on that shows when different kinds of online engagement, be it social media or surveys or interactive pinboards, whatever, when the different situations that these are useful in. So if anyone's not seen it, then that's a really useful guide, if you like, of what works where.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Any links we've mentioned throughout the presentation today, I will put in the follow-up email as well, just if people are looking to find these. The next question I've got from audience, is there any good advice for schemes not in accord with the local development plan? Contrary schemes almost always create a sense of mistrust, irrespective of the facts of the application.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think if Stephen Tolson was here, he would give a much better answer than I can to that one. I guess that the main thing that's in my mind is that there is no substitute for engaging early. So rather than waiting for the pre-application consultation, so I'm thinking of a few developers so there were various quotes around developers who had spent a long time engaging. 2 years was one of the quotes. Building relationships, building trust with local community groups. So the best thing possible to do is if a developer has a proposal which is against policy, which all developments at some point will be against policy. That's just the way it is over the long term, over 20, 30 years. Everything starts out against policy, and eventually it gets into the plan, and then after that it becomes a planning application, and it's only on the ground if it's lucky. So early engagement, speaking to community groups, the developer might think of it as generating support from their perspective, but it's also starting the conversation about, should this happen or not? Is it a good or bad thing? Is it the right thing? Should it be changed? Should it be altered? The earlier that happens, the better. And of course, the local authority could be a part of that discussion too. So it's bringing things forward to the LPP and the LDP stage.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that, and I think that's something that we're thinking about, that early on engagement and that related investment much earlier on in the process. Thinking back to things like public interest-led development and land value sharing, I think thinking about the whole process rather than just development as a part of that is important.
And it feels to me as if none of these things are new. The independent review of planning 3 or 4 years ago talked about front loading, which is what we're talking about now in different words. It's all the same stuff. It's not new. And I guess yes, we should all keep on moving towards that. And it's clear from the research we've done and the survey Kathie mentioned that it's not something which developers seem to be afraid of or seem to be concerned about. So in making policy, we shouldn't be scared of going down that line.
Okay, next question is slightly different again. It's regarding the PAC process. Should this be completely rethought, or does it still set a valid framework for the planning application stage?
I think Nick will be able to comment on the specifics of the planning process, but I think for us, and the land aspect of it all is that these types of conversations with the community, an affected community, should be happening even before site acquisition. So that's either at the local development plan phase or local place plans. It's capturing that community aspiration, embedding it and making it part of the overall process. So that links back to the land rights and responsibility statement. So again, if we're thinking about other land use changes such as forestry and agriculture, I think those aspirations need to be captured much earlier on in the process.
Yes, and what Stephen and I heard from those 44 folk we spoke to, most of whom are private sector developers, what we heard from them was that pre-application consultation starts too late. It encourages a tick box mentality. We need a more bespoke process. It shouldn't be a process at all. We need something more bespoke. So that's what we heard from them. And in response to that, the recommendations in the report put forward how that might be tackled, those 4 points I made at the end of the presentation. But that's what the development industry told us, that PAC doesn't work as it is. It's too formulaic, it's too simple, and the coverage is nowhere near enough. It doesn't go anywhere near far enough.
Okay, the next question's one very close to my own work. Is there any value in making good communication a performance indicator for local authorities to help embed collaborative working? I don't know if your research touches upon that at all.
We didn't touch upon it. I mean, I think it would be a great idea to do that. I'm not quite sure what the indicator would be. That's beyond the ability of my brain to answer off the cuff. But in principle, if a good indicator can be found, yes, that would be a good thing, because it would measure how far down the line are we going towards the ideal of a collaborative approach, working together.
I think more broadly linked to that, it's about outcomes, really, isn't it? It's about how do we measure quality places. I think that for me is the real measure, and perhaps a way to do that is looking at the extent to which community engagement is done. But yeah, it's looking at the outcomes for me.
Okay, thank you both. I'm aware we're very close to our closing time of 3 o'clock. There are a bunch of questions I'm not even able to touch upon. I will be forwarding these to Nick and Kathie, so we can hopefully address these at a future point. I would just like to thank everyone today that has tuned in, and thank you very much to Kathie and Nick for presenting today. It's been really interesting. Our next steps with this will be to once we've closed up today, you will get a very short survey, which Kathie mentioned earlier on. She's looking for just to see what you've learned from today and to help gather your thoughts. And there's a few other questions in there as well. It'd be very much appreciated if you could fill that in once we've completed. We've also recorded this session, and we will make a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording available online on our website, hopefully by this point next week. And I'll send an email around to everyone who signed up with links to share with colleagues. And we'll also, as mentioned earlier on, send out any links to any documents we mentioned throughout. And I would just like to say thanks again. I don't know if Kathie or Nick have any final comments before we come to a close.
No, that's it. But thank you so much for attending. And actually, ideas like the community engagement indicator, please put them in the survey. We're really keen to hear from you and engage with you on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you.